Good morning. It is Tuesday, April 13th. This is our bi-monthly dynamic dialogue, and today we're going to talk about where are all the chips. So this is dynamic dialogue. We do these on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. We have a variety of topics, thoughts, ideas, and we welcome everyone to come and join us. We do a short presentation and then open the forum for questions and comments. The link that you have is good for April through June, and I will send out a reminder the day of, and I send out a reminder in between with the upcoming topics and the link. So chips, we're hearing a lot about chips, and I said to myself, wow, I really scheduled this topic in a timely manner. I actually scheduled it a few weeks ago, but my timing really couldn't have been better for what's going on this week. A lot of things last week, and then yesterday, President Biden met with several CEOs in a virtual meeting to talk about the semiconductor issues. And so we're going to look at some specifics of that. The chips that everybody's talking about are semiconductors. It's a $450 billion industry made up of lots and lots of different parts. They have typically long production times. And because of the pandemic and because of the location of many of the manufacturers, there's also long transportation times. About 12% of the chips are produced in the US. So we don't have a lot of production capabilities here within the boundaries of the United States, but we consume an awful lot of those. And if you don't know anything about these chips are really the brains for the products and for the systems that they work. So they're very important components. In the automotive industry, which has really been in the news for where the pain is, here's where they're used. Well, they use them in an area called infotainment, which is now all of the entertainment and information that you have on the phone, in the car. So the things you can get on your phone, the video consoles that they put in, so people in the back seat can watch TVs, the GPS tracking things, all of that they call infotainment. Chips are very important in that area. They're important in systems like your power steering, the braking, the catalytic converters. They move the seats, the windows, airbags. They display all the stuff on your dashboard. These parts and systems contain several different sizes and several different types of chips. So they're not all in short supply, but many of them are. And of course, one little part can keep you from making the whole car. So they are come in cars. All cars need these in various different configurations, and some of the advanced safety systems that we have in cars and they're putting in cars require more chips and a broader variety of chips. So that's even more onerous on the market. Experts are saying vehicles can contain hundreds of these chips, and the latest information says chips account for about 40% of the cost of a new combustion engine. So that's up from about 18% in the year 2000. So in the last 20 years, the chips are more expensive, and they're a major part of the whole engine system. So there's a lot of applications for these within a car and a lot of different kinds of cars. So what really happened here? Actually, a lot has happened, and a lot of these factors really had to come together to get us into this position. The first big major thing that happened, of course, we all know about is COVID-19, the pandemic. So the pandemic reduced the production of automobiles. Plants, they were shut down for a couple of weeks in this time frame last year, in the March-April timeframe. And then when they opened back up, the demand was a little bit soft, and they had different protocols to deal with, so they couldn't necessarily operate at full speed. And the demand forecasts really were woefully inaccurate. They were very conservative. They thought demand would be very slow to come back to the pre-pandemic levels, and actually demand has exceeded their forecast quite a bit. So they had a slow to recover forecast, and that's not what we're actually seeing in the marketplace. We just talked about how many chips automobiles use, but the auto industry only uses about 5% of the total number of of chips that are produced annually by these major suppliers. And automobiles tend to use not cutting and bleeding edge chips, but older versions. It takes so much time to qualify these systems through the different government agencies and the safety protocols and everything that they have to do, that they don't usually have the latest and greatest chips in automobiles. So these are legacy chips. They're the tried and true ones. And what they find is companies don't want to invest in producing these older chips. So even when there's shortages, they don't put their investment in producing these. They put that in producing the more high-tech, latest version chips. Companies prefer to focus on these more advanced chips that support both the tech and the consumer products. So we have this kind of looking at this in different ways. We find that lead times grew during the pandemic on chips as well as many other products, and we aren't seeing those lead times contract again. Demand for video game players, laptops, monitors, all the kinds of equipment that you have. And I sit here and look at my extra monitor, my microphone, and the camera that I bought during the pandemic. All of those things take chips. So with more people working from home, there was a huge run on the laptop market, and that contributed to that as well. Parts suppliers that supply these to the major manufacturing automobile companies were really skeptical that the market would rebound as quickly as it has. So they were really reluctant to order in those higher volumes because they just didn't want to get stuck with the inventory. And then the car manufacturers had a lot of other issues going on. They had absenteeism from people who didn't want to work during the pandemic. They had their own issues of ramping back up after they had shut down many of their plants for some amount of time. They had other parts issues they were dealing with. And so there were a lot of things going on. Outside of the pandemic, again, we had some misjudged markets that could have been part of the pandemic, but it was also just a factor of looking at forecasts in general. The global sales are typically 70 to 80 million units per year. That fell to 66.8 million in 2020. That's down about 15%. So that downturn, some thought it was going to be more, some thought it was going to be less. But the other thing we're finding is that electric and autonomous vehicles are only 4% of sales. So the other factor here is that many car companies and many of the market industry analysts anticipated that the market would be more skewed toward these electric vehicles and these kinds of cars versus the traditional fossil fuel. And what they're finding is that demand isn't ramping up quite as high as they thought it would. So there's a lot of different configurations, and there's some different elements, and we'll talk about some of those. But the fact is that companies are not producing these. They made a lot of efforts to move toward electric vehicle production, and the fact is people are still buying cars that are non-electric vehicles. And then suppliers. In late 2019, suppliers to the car manufacturers worried about overstocks. So they were worried that and the chip companies as well, worried that they were going to get stuck with a lot of extra inventory. Many companies have adopted lean operations philosophies, and they did not want these overstocks, and they also had reduced their on-hand inventories. So suppliers of the chips in particular had reduced a lot of their on-hand inventories because they didn't want to hold that inventory because they were trying to lean their operations. So they didn't have the parts, they had whatever they had in the field, but that wasn't as much as they ultimately needed. The other couple of factors, equipment shortage. There's an equipment shortage in wafer foundries, and that limited the capacity of the companies. So if they don't have the extra equipment, then they're stuck with the capacity constraints that they have, and they haven't been able to increase production to the required areas to actually respond to this. And even if they could, their cycle times are so long that it would take quite a while to do that. And you still can't get this equipment for many foundries. And it's a very complicated, complex process to manufacture the wafers and then ultimately the chips. Production cycles got longer, transportation cycles got longer. If you think about what's happening with the ships, but as well as it's not just the ships. A lot of these parts can be shipped by air for not much money because they don't weigh very much, and you can put a lot in a small sized package. But for many months, the airfare, the air routes were curtailed considerably. So there weren't nearly as many planes flying internationally between these different companies and countries. So the transportation cycles got much, much longer just because of the infrequent flights of the cargo air and the commercial air. So there weren't as many flights to put chips on to get them moving from where they were being manufactured to where they're being made. Because I remember I told you only 12% of these chips are manufactured in the United States. And there's fewer chip makers than there were 20 years ago. There were about 30 in the year 2000 that were main serious chip makers. Today, that number is probably about half of that. There are lots of people who make chips. There's lots of companies that make small amounts of chips and specialty chips. But the kind of things we're looking at here, these major manufacturers, is not anywhere near that, the number of 30 that it was 20 years ago. There are a lot of government influence going on, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But for the businesses that have been impacted, it's interesting to see. General Motors has been impacted, and of course, General Motors has their own internal initiative to move to all non-fossil fuel vehicles by the year, I think it's 2030. And they are right now prioritizing their trucks and large SUVs, in part because that's where their margins are the highest, but also just because they have limited capacity, so they have to prioritize something. We've seen Audi, who delayed production in January. They furloughed about 10,000 workers, so they're still waiting to see when they can get some of those workers back. Ford in January stopped production in a couple plants. They furloughed workers. They're slashed their production back to maybe as little, I think in January, as like 25% of their originally planned production. So that means they are not getting the productivity out of the workers they need. Volkswagen told suppliers production rates were going to be back to pre-production levels by the end of 2020. That's what they predicted, but the suppliers really didn't buy into that, and Volkswagen didn't really hold them to that, so they are having issues. Honda has adjusted their production. They've reduced their production to like 70% of their original plans in many of their plants, and so they've scaled way back. Toyota is the one that really has not been hit very hard. Toyota had some stockpiles of parts, which is interesting when you think about the Toyota production system and being lean and things like that. But they actually had parts stockpiled, and that has helped them, and therefore they've actually boosted their profit outlook for the year. Intel is one of the chip makers that we here in the United States think of when we think of chips, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them. They have had a part to play. These are not all Intel chips that we're talking about. In fact, the largest chip manufacturer in the world is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, located in Taiwan, and that is one of the major players in this scenario. So what's actually happening right now? Automakers are prioritizing their more profitable vehicles because they're paying more for chips and they don't have as many chips. They want to try to keep their revenues and their profit margins at a reasonable place. So that's where they're putting a lot of the priorities. We're seeing price increases. So Smith & Associates is a Houston-based independent distributor, and they say they've seen prices rise as much as 5 to 20 times higher this year than in previous years. So they're seeing these parts really escalate in price. The automotive electronics industry has high growth projected, and a Deloitte study in 2019 said they think the automotive electronics is the fastest growing market in semiconductors, and it's going to be that way by 2022. So because they are increasing the features on the cars and doing things, this has been for the last 2 years projected to be a fast growing marketplace, automotive electronics. In 2022, what we're seeing is there are most of these companies, these car companies, had a lot of credits that they accumulated. And they accumulated these to meet the greenhouse emission rules, which expire at the end of the 2021 model years. So there's a lot of pressure on them to do that. Electric and hybrid vehicles use about twice the semiconductor content of a fossil fuel vehicle, and yet so companies are skewing toward those to try to manufacture more of those, but again, the market isn't keeping up quite as much with that. So we're seeing some dichotomies there. The demand for computers, as I said before, laptops, monitors, all of that kind of stuff. 5G, now you're seeing a lot of advertising about 5G types of things, and video games. That's still high, and they expect that to remain high, as a lot of people are still going to work from home through most of this year, and companies are looking at hybrid return to work models where people may be able to work from home 2-3 days a week. So however that plays out, this demand is still high for all these other electronics that consume parts. Apple, Samsung, they're still updating their phones, they're still making changes, and these are big customers. So there's still a lot of attention paid to those kinds of companies. So why does this matter to us? It matters because Ford, GM, and others say their revenues in 2021 are going to be cut by the billions of dollars. So they contribute heavily to the economy. If you're a stockholder in any of these companies, that's a big deal to you, but they do make a serious contribution toward taxes in the areas where they are located, plus just in general. And they are, again, a big part of the economy. So they support so many other types of businesses that are needed to support the whole of the auto industry. This lower vehicle production, they're producing about 811,000 globally, 175,000 in North America, less than they have in previous years. So those are some serious numbers. Their 2021 is off already because of the first quarter being hit by so many different companies in so many different ways. Q1 alone saw a decline of about 1.4 million vehicles globally. So there's a lot of that to be made up. Most of the companies have predicted making up some of those delayed outputs in Q2. First it was Q2 we could make it up. Now they're saying it may take till the end of the year to make up for the deficits in Q1 if they can get there at all. GM's predicting an operating profit loss of $1.5 to $2 billion this year. And Ford is predicting that their earnings are going to be impacted 1 to as much as $2.5 billion this year. So those are serious numbers. Again, it's impacting other products, video games, phones, and it's making them more expensive as well. TSMC, that Taiwanese company that I talked about, they produce 70% of the global auto industry chips. So there are lots of other companies, and their production toward automobiles is not very high, but they produce 70% of what auto industry consumes. So they're a key player in this, even though those types of products for them are not very high on their output list. So there's been a lot of serious attention given to what capabilities we have within the US. The pandemic brought that up in terms of PPE. We found out that most of the masks and gloves and personal protective equipment that was needed for the pandemic was not produced here in the United States. And so things were in short supply and they got really tough really fast. Some companies pivoted to be able to help with that, but this is another area with these chips where we're realizing we don't have that much capability here within the United States. So Intel is one of the main players, and Intel has said they view this being a critical inflection point for America regarding the overall chip production, that this is a big deal to this whole industry, not just automotive, but for the technology industry in general. Intel has plans to invest over $100 billion over the next 3 years. They're going to expand their Arizona fabrication sites, and they are actually opening their doors to produce chips for other companies, something they've never done before. But they feel that they do have some capacity and some capability, and they are going to be open to that because they think that's going to be good for them in the long run. They're not doing this out of the kindness of their heart, although it is a good thing to do, but they also see a real payback in that situation. So where are we going to go from here? Alex Partners is a consulting firm, and they are projecting that this chip shortage is going to be about a $60 billion hit to the auto industry. Biden has a $2 trillion infrastructure proposal you've probably heard about. Inside that, there are $50 billion for the auto industry to help not only with these chips, but with other aspects of the auto industry, including helping them morph from fossil fuel vehicles to more electric and autonomous vehicles. The White House in February issued an executive order that includes a 100-day review, a task force they outlined. If you want to see that, you can look it up online under the February 24th executive order. And they are looking at advanced batteries, those used in electric vehicles. They're looking at pharmaceuticals because we know we've been impacted by COVID and a lot of the pharmaceuticals in and around that. Critical minerals that we've heard things about for this last several years, semiconductors themselves, and the initial report, this is a 1-year task force, and the initial report, that 100-day review, is due in the late May, June timeframe, 100 days after the 224 kickoff, and then they'll have time to compile the reports and things like that and get them out to the rest of us. So that's something for us all to look for in that probably June timeframe. What else is happening? There's a lot happening. Department of Commerce met last week with a lot of tech executives, including Matt Blunt, who's president of the American Automotive Policy Council, and John Bozzella, who's the CEO of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Honestly, these are organizations I've never heard of, but they are big organizations, and they play a lot of part in setting policy for the automotive industry. They, at this meeting last week, they urged the Biden administration to adopt policies to encourage U.S. chip production, including maybe offering investment tax credits for companies who are doing just that. So I said, Intel said they're going to spend $100 billion in investment. If they can get a tax credit for that, that's going to be a really good thing for them, and they might even do a little bit more. But that's one of the things that this meeting last week with the Department of Commerce came to light, is to really encourage the Biden administration to do some things about this. And there are a lot of international pressures. The German economy minister has been pressuring Taiwan to provide chips to German automakers and to prioritize those German automakers over other ones. And if you don't know, you should Google and see just how many car companies are under the Volkswagen umbrella. It's many more than you think. They make a lot of cars that don't have a VW sticker on them. So the German car industry is a huge player in the auto industry. Chinese officials are asking chip makers, many of who are located in and around China, they want them to allocate more chips to China and be more investing in things that are local. So they're going to continue to put pressure on there. The US auto manufacturers have weighed in as well. What they have expressed is that they have much less confidence in their suppliers' ability to provide the chips than they do in other manufacturers. And we have to keep in mind that the auto manufacturers themselves, Ford and GM, they don't buy most of these parts. Most of these parts are bought by the companies that make their subsystems. So the people who put their parts together on behalf of GM and Ford to their specifications, but it's not GM and Ford directly who are buying these chips. And in some cases, it's a lot of the contract manufacturers who make boards and sell these boards to all these other manufacturers who put the boards in systems like the brake system and the airbag system and in your dashboard and things like that. So the supply chains get very, very complicated with just who is actually purchasing these chips. And they're not necessarily combining their purchasing power readily to attack this. But now you're seeing more and more the parent auto industry company getting involved. We know that GM sent a letter to their suppliers in the last part of last year, asking them to secure chips for a year. So basically asking them to stockpile a year's worth of parts. GM recently has declined to comment on that, but that letter was sent out according to several suppliers. And again, asking them to stockpile parts is counterintuitive to trying to get the allocation and trying to keep everybody moving. So again, these, a lot of the automakers are now not talking to their suppliers who they have been talking to, but they're going direct to the chip makers, trying to kind of end around. So, and that's not necessarily in conjunction with the suppliers. They're kind of going over their heads into that, trying to use their weight and their clout to influence the chip makers to get them what they need. So there's a lot of people putting pressure in a lot of different areas. And Volkswagen is considering buying chips directly and then like consigning them to their suppliers, or actually buying capacity from a couple of different chip manufacturers so that they have that capacity dedicated to their cars. So there's a lot of different scenarios being played out and being optioned to see what happens. Again, Biden signed this executive order on 2/24, and they've said very clearly this is focused both on near-term actions and longer-term solutions. So there are a lot of people that this executive order enlisted, including not just government agencies, but also telling them to pull people from academia, to pull companies, subject matter experts from various industry leaders, and anywhere else that there are people that can help. So what's going to happen next is we see the automobile production is impacted. It is definitely impacted. These automobile companies are not building what they might like to sell into 2020. They're not building everything they want to build, and they're not building as much of what they wanted to build. And they think that this could continue well into 2022. Both chip makers and automakers have said, we're going to recover in the second half of 2021. But industry officials and analysts are saying, well, maybe not. It might take into 2022 to recover. So you would expect the chip makers and the auto manufacturers to be a little more on the optimistic side and trying to convey that they can get a handle on this. But the industry analysts are saying maybe not. Car companies and other chip users are still looking at this, and what you're going to see is they're going to demand more transparency into the supply chains. So again, Ford and GM typically have just bought systems, subsystems, subassemblies from their suppliers and let their suppliers worry about their lower level suppliers, other than designing in the chips and telling them which ones to use and where to go buy those. Now you're seeing that these companies are going to just demand transparency across that supply chain to understand that better and to help avoid problems like this in the future. That's probably good news and bad news. Getting that transparency is good, and it might help avoid these kinds of situations going forward, but demanding that transparency can mean that they get too much into their supplier's business, and that can be a kind of a backfiring strategy as well. So we'll have to wait and see how that happens. Car companies are probably going to work more closely with the chip manufacturers from now on. They have not done that in the past. They've kind of kept that at arm's length past the design phase, but you're probably going to see those relationships that they are forging now, trying to get through this, that they are going to be in place, and they're going to be working those going forward. NXP is one of the bigger players as well, as the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company. But NXP had a fire in Japan that seriously damaged one of their facilities. And they have 2 plants in Austin, Texas, that were hit by the February freeze. So they're still trying to recover in both of those areas. So that's 3 different plants that were affected, 1 by a fire, 2 by a freeze. The freeze is easier to recover from, but the fire was in October. So they're in that mode, but they've been hit overall with their production. So this has slowed that down. And how they're allocating is kind of up to these manufacturers and these companies. So they're trying to see what they can do to make the most of this situation too. They have upped their production as much as they can, but again, they are seriously constrained by equipment and availability. So what I know for sure is we're in the middle of this challenge, and we're going to be here for a while. This is not going to blow over. The first things that I started seeing in January, they were saying, oh, by the end of June, things should be kind of back to normal. That isn't going to happen. We've seen companies start to hoard and stockpile, not good behaviors. We saw that last year with the toilet paper, and that is not a good way to manage that. If you know anything about the bullwhip effect, that's what you're seeing is these demands are artificially inflated now because companies are thinking, well, I need, say, 100,000. But if I order 150,000, that'll give me a better chance to get the 100,000 that I actually really do need. So they're artificially inflating orders. Again, there's multiple sides interacting with the chip manufacturers, trying to influence the allocation process. And that's going to change and be kind of all over the place. They talked to the German economy minister, and he tells them one thing, and then they talk to the Chinese delegate, and they tell them something else, and they're all wanting these parts. They're all wanting these same parts and more of them. So there's a lot of pressure from a lot of different players in this whole thing. Companies are trying to outbid each other. So we're seeing, again, the distributor in Houston said they've seen prices go up to 20 times what they were before. And some of these parts are not very expensive, but some of them are decidedly expensive. So that it's going to range all over the place. The relationships that were in place pre-pandemic, these have changed, and they're not going back. They have changed. They'll probably change some more, but these relationships, supplier to chip manufacturers, and how the suppliers are dealing with their direct customer, whether it's GM or Ford or Honda, whatever, then those relationships are going to be changed. What we're seeing is that the big manufacturers are still want the business from Apple's and Samsung and whatever. So they are taking priority with the chip makers. And again, the chip makers are still focused on the newer technologies, not the older technologies. So it's not exciting to them or a good business bet to try to go invest a lot of money in equipment for parts that were made in some cases 10 years ago. So these older legacy, the fact that these are older legacy parts makes it even worse because that equipment and those processes change. And once you change that process, you have to really reset it up, and that's very difficult to do. We know too that car buyers are going to be hit by higher prices. not just on new cars, but on used markets, because people who need cars and who wanted cars to get new cars, if they can't get them, then they're looking for later models, cars from any source they can get. So the car buying prices for March were up 13% over 2020 March. And they say this is the highest inflation since 2017. Now, 2020 March is when we announced that there was a pandemic and people started to see that. So it's interesting to see that those March prices are up 13%, but I think it's going to be telling to see what the April and the May prices are versus the pandemic, because once the pandemic hit, prices lowered because not as many people were buying cars at that point. So that these percentages, again, you have to take those with a grain of salt and consider the conditions that those were calculated in. So it's going to be interesting. And what we really know is only time will tell. This is a serious global issue. There's a lot of things going on in the United States, but it involves many other countries because, again, most of these chips are not produced here in the United States. They are made in Taiwan, they are made in China, they're made in Thailand, they're made in Japan. So they are made in various sites in Asia, but there's a few big players in this market, and they're going to be the ones kind of moving the needles. So what I'm going to say is stick around, and I'm probably going to do an update of this sometime in June or July, probably July, after we get some of these reports to see what's going on. So where are the chips? We still are waiting for those. So here's what we're going to do next for Dynamic Dialog. I'm going to talk about China and global trade in 2 weeks. Then we're going to look at soft skills for supply chain professionals. I've done a couple of different presentations on skills, but this one in particular is going to talk about soft skills. In the end of May, we're going to talk about supply chain resilience. This is another word that I see everywhere now with supply chains. It used to be flexibility and agility. Now we're seeing resilience. So I'm going to talk about what that means and what that might mean for you and your company. Investment management inventory management strategies. We're going to look at those in June, and that's the last one I have identified at this point. If you have any suggestions for topics, you can always send them to me at my direct email, jane@purple-link.net. And you can check out our website for other events going on and other things. If you or your company is interested in learning more about this or learning how Purple Link can help your business, you can always do a 30-minute free call. Just callwithjane.com, and that will take you to my calendar. You can schedule a time and we can see if it's a good fit and talk about ways to work together. I do have online workshops. You can enroll from the website. We're doing a CPSM exam number 2 right now. It started March 29th, but it's not too late. All the sessions are recorded. So we're 2 weeks in, and if you signed up now, you could still easily catch up by watching the first 2 videos. Each class is an hour-and-a-half long, so the videos are no more than that and usually somewhat a little bit less. So it's a great time to become certified in 2021, and stay tuned more for this spring. Right now, I'm anticipating a workshop the 1st of June. I think it's going to be on risk-based thinking, but things could change. So stay tuned for that. And then I will leave you with this thought. Time has a wonderful way of showing us what really matters. So we're looking at things now into a year into the pandemic and a few months into this chip shortage. And hindsight is always a good judge. So time will show us what really matters and where we need to be putting our focus. So with that, I'm going to cease my presentation and I'll open it up for questions or comments. Anybody have anything they'd like to share?